Well, last week you all had a Memorial Weekend sermon. I was out of town, and I had an opportunity to spend family reunion at Butler Springs. Had a great time, and it was worth every bit of it. It was kind of fast, and being with 100 Bennetts can be somewhat overwhelming, but it was fun, and I got an opportunity to preach, and really enjoyed that. Before Memorial Weekend, we finished up chapter 4 of James. We are in a current sermon series on James, and the theme of James overall is living rightly. That is the message of the book of James, living rightly. Are we living rightly? May be the question that you ask as you work through the book on your own. In each section, James articulates a way of living rightly through the community and our relationship to God and our relationship to other believers and to the world. But in this passage that we highlighted in chapter 4, 13 through 17, was a passage on humility. We're quick to go to the very end of that chapter and catch the verse, for any man who knows the good he ought to do and does not do it is sin. That verse, I've used that verse for doing an entire ministry, and had good intentions and everything with it. In the context, though, it is rightly understood in humility. I don't want to take anything away from that verse in isolation. It actually gives it even more of a strength as you see it in context. Because the context is those that are boasting about the day and moving about where they're going to go, where they're going to work, how God is going to provide. An emphasis on the self, forgetting to call upon God. And that is the message that James is trying to articulate, that if it is the Lord's will, let it be so. In other words, our life shouldn't reflect a transition of asking God what to do after we've already done it. No, we ask God as we go throughout our lives. And by doing so, we act out in humility. It takes humility. See, the opposite of this is pride. Pride would have us say, no, I do not need to depend upon God. Pride would say, I've got this under control. Get through my work week, and then I meet up with God on Sunday. It's a type of arrogance that we each have gone through. All of us go through a time of this. And this is why James emphasizes it so strongly. And towards the end there, he says that anyone who knows the good he ought to do and does not do it, he sins. And the good we ought to do is relying on God, utterly dependent upon Him for everything in our life. That requires humility. It requires that I am not large and in charge, and that He is. So, throughout the letter of James, he's been emphasizing my brothers. He's talking to Christians. And in this passage, he's talking, it appears he's talking to a group of Christians as well. And then we get to James chapter 5, which can leave some people a little puzzled on what James is doing. Let's read this verse aloud. If you would, just please stand with me. We'll go ahead and read these 6 verses together, and then we'll go through them. All right. James chapter 5, 1 through 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. You may be seated. For some of you, if this is the first time you've read this verse, it very well might be somewhat troubling. It was troubling for me the first time I read it. As I went through that, I was thinking, what is he talking to? What is he talking about? It seems like there's this transition that happens in the flow of the letter. James, throughout this letter, he's been talking to my brothers, the Christians, the faithful. And then we come to this, and it's this stark contrast. Well, there is a stark contrast for a reason. The transition from chapter 4 is introduced with a sharp turn into a rhetorical way with the now listen. If you look at the beginning of verse 1, it says, now listen. James does this on purpose. He does this to get his listeners' attention. In other words, there is a deliberate emphasis in this transition. But who is James referring to? Has James left the community of believers? Is he now speaking to a whole other context? And if so, say he perhaps is speaking to the rich rulers, those who have land, abundant land, the wealthy. Would they be listening? Would they be hearing? How would this letter have circulated to them? Throughout the letter of James, there has been a deliberate emphasis on the brothers. And now he addresses his audience as you rich people. See, throughout, there's always been, this is another thing that we lose in translation from Greek to English. All of these are you all. You all. So when he's talking about you all my brothers, he's talking about the believers. He's talking about those in Christ. And so here, it's even like you all of you rich people, perhaps. He's addressing this, and it's kind of in a declarative sense. But why does he do this? Perhaps James is speaking against a particular group within this community. Perhaps there was some. But there wasn't that many rich Christians at the time. They were scattered abroad. There wasn't much land to be owned. A letter like this was probably read and is read out loud and then passed on to the next small church and done so in a very quiet manner, because a letter like this may have been seized. In the first century, there would not have been many wealthy landowners and only a small amount of merchants within the community of believers. So why does he do this? Is this a warning against the rich and powerful? Would the wealthy hear this message? Whomever James is addressing, he is doing so with a prophetic voice, with a sense of condemnation, by insinuating the misery that is coming upon you. If you look at the end of the verse, he says it very plainly, the misery that is coming upon you. Perhaps James is aiming at anyone that is wealthy, believer or non-believer. If so, it would make sense of him to redirect his audience to not be like the rich people who enslaved and robbed the poor. We all remember, well, most of us may remember the Disney movie Robin Hood. I always loved watching that growing up. I don't know why, but I loved it. And in this movie, you see this battle against Robin Hood stealing to get treasure to give it to the poor. There's this picture there of the wealthy over here and the poverty over here, and a great divide between them. One is depicted as the lower class, and one is elevated as the higher class. And the one that's in the lower class doesn't receive anything. They're scrounging around to the point where some figure would go and steal to offer aid. That's not the picture I'm hoping to present to you today. But if you've seen the movie, you see the tension between the two classes of individuals. And so James has just transitioned from a context of worrying about today and where we're going to work and and boasting about the day and how we're going to make money, and answers it by giving them a message of humility, to now this larger picture, perhaps a picture that is meant to be a pronouncement of judgment against those, for those that are Christians in this time frame. They're undergoing some of the oppression similar to in the movie of Robin Hood. The picture there is somewhat real. And it's not that times have really changed today. There is still some of this. However, there's a danger in overemphasizing what James is doing here. It's not that James is degrading the wealthy and elevating the poor, but that he is sending a message that elevate the poor. Elevate the poor. If you are rich, be rich in humility. And if you are poor, be rich in the things that you have. Be rich in the humility that God offers. Notice how James pronounces the exact opposite of the statement made by Jesus in the Beatitudes. In Matthew 6:3 it reads, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Do you remember what James said at the end of chapter 1? He said to look after the orphans and the widows. Are we appropriating wealth rightly? Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." We have this concept of what is rich? What is wealth? What does it mean to be rich? In North America, even the poorest is still really the richest amongst most of the world. There's this uneven balance of how we articulate and how we even think about money. The way that James is addressing each one of these issues is he's doing so in a way that his audience understands that what is really important are those that Jesus emphasized. Those that are without, those that do not have, those that are orphans or widows, as James puts it. So are we appropriating our wealth rightly? Let's look at verse 2. He continues, "Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes." Notice again the echo of Jesus' message. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. However, there is a contrast to be noticed in these two passages. Jesus emphasizes the concept of sharing, whereas James' message is concerned with those that withhold. James is addressing these people that are withholding the day's wage of the people. And he's doing this in a very emphatic way. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. We see a picture in Jesus' message where there's a connection to the eternal, things that will come at the end of time, where everything we own will fade. Nothing here is going to go with us. And yet you see James capturing this moment right in the present and emphasizing it as well. When we store up our stuff and hoard the things that we own, we're doing what Jesus is saying not to do. When we receive our day's wage, we should share. That is the message of Jesus. This is a basic component of displaying dignity and practicing humility. It's important for the owner or the master or the boss to pay the employee, and it's important for the employee to share with his wage. And this isn't a concept that's new. We find it all the way back in Leviticus. A man is worth his wage. But consider Jesus' message. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. This isn't the message that is being articulated by the people who are the rich. in James's words. They're not doing unto others as that they would have done to themselves. And so I guess our question is, are we doing unto others as we would have done to ourselves? Are we appropriating our wealth rightly? Let's look at verse 3. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in these last days. In this verse, James says your gold and silver are corroded. Literally, they will rust. However, gold and silver do not rust. Did James not know this? Why is James articulating this message in this manner? I don't think it's that he did not know. I think that he does this on purpose. There's a deliberate reason in this. The incorrect concept portrays an emphatic apocalyptic warning. All will fade away in this world. It doesn't matter what we have, it's going to fade. It will be gone. We don't carry anything with us. There's no need in filling up the casket. There's no need in filling up the backyard of all these different things that we can keep and hold on to. But there is a line. The line is that whatever we do with our wealth, we do it practicing humility. This doesn't mean that we're not allowed to have things. And that's not what James is saying. The message that James is pushing in this section is against the very wealthy. The ones who have all the fine things and treat the poor as if they were nothing. The poor to the point to where they don't even get paid. Listen to it again. He says, you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields. They're crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. This practice was not something unusual for a worker to receive his wage. As mentioned earlier, the passage in Leviticus 19:3, it says, you shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. It's almost like James has got this message and he's preaching to these people over here because he knows that the believers are going to come in contact with them. Whether or not they hear the message or not, there is a redemptive quality that's being introduced in this. For some of them are undergoing these things as James is writing this. And as James's letter starts to begin to go into circulation, they're dealing with this. So this message is really twofold. There's the condemnation of those that are withholding the wages and holding people, holding their funds from them. And then there's the prophetic voice that you're going to be okay. The message to them wasn't in the same way. But yet this message is also a warning to them. For they could be blessed in the days to come. And they could find themselves to be wealthy in the days to come. And if that day were to happen, James is letting them know what they cannot do. And that is hoard it for themselves. Notice how James interjects the Lord Almighty at the end of verse 4. It says, the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. The term used here for Lord is kurios, which has been somewhat absent in this letter. But now he pronounces it with a bold tone. And in this prophetic context, what is he doing? Is James pointing to something? I think so. I think he is giving us allusion to the second coming, where the Lord will return with a sword in his mouth and take vengeance upon the wicked. We have the opportunity to make the decisions in our life to whether or not we are practicing humility rightly, or whether or not we are hoarding the things that we have taking advantage of people and not paying them their dues. Either way, the Lord is going to have the last word. Verse 5, it says, "You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter." You know, we read this, and none of us in here are millionaires. We read this and we think, well, this isn't us at all. But I find myself a little convicted at times, because I think we do live luxurious. I think we have a lot more than what we seem to appear to have. Either way, we must appropriate our wealth rightly, whether it is considered rich in the world's eyes or not. What we do with our money is important. It's important that we take heed to the warning that's been given in this message. That we look back at chapter 4 and remember exactly what it is that James is calling us to do. And that's to practice humility, relying on God, relying on Him to make the steps in our lives, not asking for His advice after the fact. And if we are blessed, we know what to do with that money. It's not to go buy an island off of Florida. If some of you are Yahoo people, you might have seen there was this big picture that was on Yahoo. It's probably still there if you go there this afternoon. You can buy, there's an island for sale right now. Oh, it looks beautiful too. It's $12 million. Some of you may be close to that already. And you can have everything you want. Total isolation. You don't have to visit anybody. People actually would have to come to you. They would have to fly or swim, take a boat, one or the other. But you see, even in the concept of this, as people are really rushing to figure out who's going to buy this, there's a sense of individualism in this. There's a sense of individualism in this message that James is warning against. Those that are in this lifestyle, it's about me. It's about me. I need an island. Sure, I'd love to have an island, but I don't think I'll ever go buy an island. And I don't think we should get hung up into the mentality that's inherent in that attitude. The attitude is not one of humility. It's one that is of arrogance and pride. I deserve this. I deserve this. But what is this day of slaughter? He says in verse 5, "You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter." Is this a call for a buffet? What is James talking about? This is a pronouncement of doom and judgment. Those who hoard their wealth in this life will not be invited to the grand feast in heaven. Consider the rich man and Lazarus, as Lazarus just could see how much pain and agony the rich man was in. There was no hope or chance for the rich man after the fact. Are we appropriating our wealth rightly? Look at verse 6. It says, "You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you." How is this message similar to chapter 2, when James speaks against showing favoritism? Do you remember the message on favoritism? I had David and Luke would come up, and I asked one of them to sit down, and I asked the other to sit on the floor. And I asked everybody if there's anything wrong with that. And you all gave me the look quickly, as you should. There's something wrong with it. What it is it's an unbalance. It's an unbalance. And that is what we're dealing with in this text. We're dealing with those that are so consumed in what they have that they would even take from those who have nothing. Now, I'm sure none of us are in this category. We don't all live in mansions, and none of us have thousands of workers underneath our But does it need to be some big picture for us to fall into that category? Showing favoritism, which is in chapter 2, and what's articulated here in chapter 5, taking advantage of workers, are reflective of a heart that is corrupted. It's reflective of a heart that has not been transformed by the renewing of the mind. It's not a heart that has been won to Jesus Christ. It's a heart that's consumed by the enemy. It's a heart that is evil. It is set over and against the ways of God. And it's in direct connection with the wisdom of this world that we combated against it in chapter 4. The wisdom of God, the wisdom of the world. Anything that opposes God in this world is not of His wisdom or His understanding. And it should not be in any of our directions. So what is the resolution? The resolution for anyone in this mentality is to turn from their pride and practice humility rightly. This is what James meant when he said, anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. We see this passage, and where it's even placed, is placed so perfectly right in the middle of everything in chapter 4 and leading into chapter 5. That passage was not meant to be put there for no reason. It was put there on purpose because it is that proverbial statement. It is that timeless truth that can be used in so many ways because it draws all the context prior and all the context forward. What James is doing is brilliant. In the Greek language, it's beautiful. He's letting us know that if we want to overcome this, if you come across someone who's in this mentality, the message that is to be presented to them is one that is of humility. One that is of utter dependence upon God. And then you may even tell them what is coming for them if they do not turn. Just as James has in this. And just as those that read this in the first century out loud for people to hear, the message rang in the ears. Therefore, discerning wealth rightly is done so by practicing humility. But where is the redemption in this passage and how much of it is unpacked? There is an implied time. There's an implied time to repent. This has not happened yet. If you have suffered and been taken advantage of, your situation will be made new. Here's where there's so many dynamics that James unpacks here. He's warning against those that act like this, and in the same sense, he's offering justification for the one that has undergone this. He's allowed them to know that what's happened is wrong, and God is going to deal with it. So hold on, hang on. I'm sure most of us in here have been taken advantage of. I'm sure maybe at times some of us maybe even taken advantage of someone else. We all know what it feels like to be taken advantage of. It doesn't have to necessarily be money to undergo this feeling. God will redeem you, and your enemies will be punished. If you have suffered, things will be made new. But if you are guilty of this mentality, there's still time to change. The day of slaughter is yet to come. Are we appropriating our wealth rightly? Listen to the words of Isaiah in chapter 25. It says, "On this mount the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples. a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all people, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove the disgrace of his people from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. In that day they will say, surely this is our God. We trusted in him, and he saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in him. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. Are we glad in our salvation today? Are we hopeful for the things to come? Are we utterly relying on God and our lives? You don't have to be the wealthy landowner to take a quick inventory of your life. I ask you, I plead with you to examine your life. Take it on a smaller level and look at the way you've been dealing with and interacting with people. Perhaps there is change that needs to come. Let us pray.